All right. Well, welcome back to the Making Space podcast. As always, I'm joined with Benjamin Wendell and Jay Kim. It's good to see y'all here today. How's it going?
Doing well. Good to see you guys.
Yeah, likewise. So great to see you, and hello to all of our listeners again.
Well, I'm excited to talk with you all today about the interview that I did with Amanda Iglesias. She is an architect, and she just had a lot of insightful ideas and thoughts around the design process and construction and all of these things that we don't always think about on this podcast because we get all heady and intellectual about these things, but she had some tangible ideas to give us. And so first, before we kick that off and talk more about the interview that I had with her, I'd love to hear from you all. What is a significant church space that you've been in, that you've just walked into and you've been like, man, the design of this space is just amazing and beautiful? What about you, Ben?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I've walked into plenty of beautiful church spaces, be it cathedrals or so forth, that have had that awe-inspiring effect. I've spent most of my ministry life, though, working in just pretty normal church buildings. And my personal journey has been that the most beautiful spiritual works for me have been in fairly simple and ordinary places. I think back to the church buildings, so to speak, that I experienced being raised as a pastor's kid. And, you know, they were like school halls that were rented out. And I have great memories of what God did in those places. So I've kind of covered the spectrum, but I've seen God's presence show up in amazing ways in the most simple of settings.
That's so good. I totally relate to that too. I think the beauty of a space is certainly aesthetic and visual and visceral and experiential, but it's also so deeply embedded in the actual sort of human experience of the space. So yeah, I totally agree. I think so many of the most beautiful spaces I've been to, church spaces, have really been about the people, not just the place. But to talk about place and space, I will say where I am, just north of me in San Francisco, my wife graduated from USF, the University of San Francisco, for grad school, and it's a Jesuit school. So their chapel there, her graduation for her master's degree was in their chapel, which is called St. Ignatius Church, founder of the Jesuit order. And his work, Ignatius, actually, since then, Ignatius's work has become so influential in my life in so many ways, with the Examen and some other things. But it's stunning. It's just, my church, which is a beautiful church, looks nothing like that. It's just, you walk in and it is what you would imagine a more sort of high church tradition to look like. What was so interesting about that is, like, the Jesuits are not really, necessarily known, at least their spirituality is very simple and beautiful, but it's this, incredible sort of awe-inspiring, almost ancient Roman basilica type structure. And and it's not far from here. So that might be one of the most stunning sort of physical church spaces I've ever been in.
Cool. Well, that's great to hear. We're going to dive in now with the Amanda Iglesias conversation. Just want to give our listeners a fair warning. She lives in New York City, and so we hear some urban noises, including some sirens and some birds, so some nature's mixed in there as well. So hopefully that's not too distracting, but it was a great conversation. She is an AI architect at Robert A.M. Stearns Architects in New York City. And one of the cool things that she does is she is also the curator of the Architecture of Prayer, which it's actually an international survey of contemporary church architecture. And it's currently on display at the Valparaiso University. And it's just a collection of different architectural works across the world, highlighting different church buildings and just the beautiful elements of these buildings. And so I think it's really cool to check that out. She also does a bunch of research and curation via the Iglesias project, which seeks to enliven the church senses of possibility in architectural imagination. And her writing has also been published in Christianity Today, the New York Review of Architecture and Architecture Today. So she's quite the accomplished architect and a deep thinker about the work that she does. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that she talked a lot about the value of the design process and actually helping churches coalesce around a vision of who they are and their particular giftings. And I guess I would say I hadn't actually given a lot of thought of the value add that this actually brings to a church when they're considering some kind of physical improvement. And I'm curious, both of you working in the church world, have you given much thought to these design processes, or have you seen that play out in any other form within your own church as you're seeking to coalesce around what does it mean to be a church and how we're presenting that gifting in our local context?
Yeah, I mean, for us here at our church, it's such a pertinent conversation point because we're in the middle of preparing and planning some projects that'll expand. It won't really expand. It'll reimagine our space. We're basically taking what currently is a parking lot and turning it into a community space for our city for a number of reasons, trying to blur the lines, the geographic lines really between our church and our city. Yeah. And you mentioned this earlier before we hit record, Sara Joy, and so I've been thinking about it. And really what I come to is like, I've not really given the process as much intentional thought as I probably should. I think I've just sort of outsourced it like, there are professionals who think about the process, but I love the idea in general that, everything has a theological framework. Everything is spiritual in nature, as followers of Jesus. As I was thinking about it, before we hit record, just thinking about the precision and the artistry of even God's instructions about the building of the tabernacle, right, which eventually becomes the temple, or even earlier than that, like the ark, like Noah's ark sort of thing. Like just there's a real sort of, there's an architectural beauty, like literal architectural beauty woven throughout the scriptures. So for me, Benjamin, I'd love to hear your experience, but for me, like I just realized, like, man, I probably don't give enough thought to the actual process of it, and maybe like I don't invite God into that process maybe as much as I ought to.
Yeah, I know in my journey, Jay, I can probably be guilty of maybe not inviting enough people into those processes, because a building project in a church quickly becomes a construction project and a fundraising project. Yeah. And my focus would pretty quickly go to those two practical elements of how are we going to do this, construction, how do we raise the money to achieve this? And so I think that's the reality that pastors live out in terms of buildings and facility upgrades. One of the great values that, again, I don't think I did enough, but I can see how valuable it would be, is when the right people are involved and that circle is widened. Not only does it give great input, but it probably mitigates a little bit on the back end of what pastors go through with church design and church building, which is this. You would imagine if you go and do an extension, everybody in your church would love it, right? They're gonna fill your inbox with emails of joy and congratulations, and it can be surprising when that's not the case, where they're like, well, I thought, it could be this color. The proverbial color of the carpet comments come out. Extended involvement probably helps with a little bit of that as well, where people are aware of, oh no, I think that there were a lot of people involved in that process.
One of the things that you mentioned, Jay, was that you said, I kind of just outsource this to the people who are the experts. And it was interesting too, because Amanda did really say, yes, like find yourself a good architect, find somebody who can really understand beauty and can really understand translating your church vision and gifting into the architecture and the design. So that was a key thing that she really stressed, that she felt was important for churches to have somebody who's gifted in that way to bring them along in that process. And then two, Benjamin, having the right people speak to it, right, and give good feedback in that process too. So those are both things that she highlighted as well in her conversation. One of the things too that she gave as an example that I just thought was so thought-provoking was really how a church can actually bring redemption even to the actual construction process. And that is not something I had thought about at all, but she gave the story of a church that actually used formerly incarcerated people to help with the construction of the project itself, and how that in and of itself was just a way for the church to provide, a good job and redemption for these people. And so I just thought that was such a beautiful picture. I'd be curious your reactions to that.
I just think it's a beautiful example of, again, it's kind of connected to your first question, Sara Joy. It's just a beautiful example of thinking really holistically and narratively about the process, that it's easier to just say, oh, we're building a building and the building has this particular purpose. But to ask the question, well, beyond building the building for a functional purpose, like what other purposes might God have for the entire process? Like could there be a redemptive purpose here for the person that's, nailing the nails into the wood and pouring the concrete, or the vendor who's bringing lunch, or whatever. And
right.
I was just going to say, I love that sort of approach, that a building is about more than just its functional reality, but it tells a story, and it tells a story not just once it's built, but it tells a story as it's being built. And I do wonder if that even sort of can help shape and form the story it tells once it is built, so.
Well, see, that's a great answer, Jay. I knew it. I knew it. I have experienced similar things with church construction journeys, where there is something that can really inspire people that are not connected with the church at all, but the tradesperson, the carpenter, the plumber, the electrician, the builder, and they're on site and they ask questions like, oh, so what's this for? What kind of a church is this? And so to have intentional openness towards that, if you're a church going through a building process, like, hey, for every person that steps foot on this land or in this space, on this building, let's be praying and believing that God would move on their hearts.
I think, too, just giving so much respect to the tradespeople and really having conversations and getting to know who they are on the site is so important. In my previous work in real estate development, I would have to go to construction sites quite often. And that was one of the joys for me, was getting to know the tradespeople on site and the people doing the work, because it's hard physical labor, and they are giving a lot of time and effort to building something. And so giving respect for that is really great. All right. Well, I'm super excited for our listeners to hear this conversation. I think they'll really benefit from Amanda's ideas and her love of just architecture and beauty and the way that she expresses that in this conversation. So as always, you can learn more about this podcast at barna.com/making space. And I hope our listeners, again, enjoy this conversation and are inspired. So without further ado, here's the conversation with Amanda. Hi, Amanda. It's so great to have you here on the podcast today. I'm particularly excited that I get to interview an architect, because I have a secret dream of being an architect. So welcome so much to the Making Space podcast.
Thank you, Sara Joy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and just have this conversation between theology, architecture, worship. These are just really special subjects to me. So looking forward to.
Yeah, it sounds like they're near and dear to your heart. So in that vein, as an architect who's done a lot of work around sacred architecture, can you share a little bit more with our audience about this international survey that you've been conducting over the past few years called the Architecture of Prayer? That's really interesting. So what exactly is this survey exploring?
Yeah, so a little bit about myself and specifically this work. I'm an architect by day, working in New York City at a firm and actually doing single family residential. But on the side, I have this project called the Iglesias Project, which is my last name, and it's Spanish for churches. And it's something I started about 5 years ago as I was traveling and documenting just incredible contemporary churches, specifically in Europe, and just documenting them. And out of that came an opportunity to curate an exhibition called The Architecture of Prayer, and it opened last year at Calvin University, and it has now traveled to 2 other schools. Most recently opened at Valparaiso. It was at Wheaton earlier this year, and now it's at Valpo, which is in Indiana, Chicagoland. And that is a snapshot of really the state of contemporary sacred architecture in the past 20 years, and looking at projects all over the world, all different Christian denominations, ranging from Catholic to Orthodox to different Protestant traditions.
So talk to us a little bit more about that. What has stood out to you in your observations with this study about these various forms of architecture, particularly modern architecture with churches? Any particular international examples that have been useful to you or triggering some deep thinking on your end?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's quite a range that I'm showing, which is very intentional. I'm not trying to put forward any one style, any one even scale of building or budget. There's multi-million-dollar projects. There's projects that were constructed on a dime. And I want it to reflect in a real way the challenges that churches have to face when they're considering their building and wanting to invest in the actual space that they're in, whether that's a renovation or tear down, rebuild, or even pursuing a new property. And so these projects act as individual case studies, specifically between architects and church communities, because I really want to put forward the role, which I obviously am biased here as an architect, but just the invaluable role of bringing on a really good architect on a project that maybe they don't have a strong portfolio in sacred space, but they're just excellent listeners. They can think outside of the box, and they are potentially very famous, or maybe they're a local firm that is down the street from your church community. But each of these examples show what a beautiful collaboration is possible when a community acts in faith and brings on an architect to really entrust them with a vision that architecture is actually important to us as worshiping beings, and it matters to invest in not just pragmatic updates and considerations such as HVAC and structural, but actually to think more spiritually in a different dimension. And so that's what these projects are doing, and they have an extra element of prayerfulness, worshipfulness that go beyond just a simple update or a renovation.
I love that you're talking about that, of how architecture can speak to these spiritual sides of who we are. And, Barna Group in their research has done a lot of question asking around that, of the role of the built environment, architecture, and sacred spaces, and how that plays out. One of the things that they have found is that 39% of practicing Christians actually say that church architecture and transcendence can bring a sense of being led into prayer. And what's even more interesting, I think, is that those who don't attend church at all, when asked this question, still 15% of those people feel that sacred architecture does that work of leading them into prayer. And, we often think of prayer as an individual act, but can you help us understand that connection between prayer and architecture and how those things interplay together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'll share by way of 2 recent examples. Just last week, I was at Valparaiso for the opening of the exhibit, and it was timed concurrently with their Institute of Liturgical Studies annual conference, in which Valpo is a Lutheran university, and so it's a Lutheran-specific gathering across the different traditions that converged. And the Chapel of Resurrection is Valparaiso's campus chapel, and it was designed in the late 1950s and is one of the most exquisite pieces of architecture I've actually ever been in. And I had only seen photos, but showing up in person during a worship service, it was an even song in which the way that the building is actually faced, it is the historic east-west orientation in which the sun rises over the eastern altar and it sets over the western narthex. And the walls are sort of corrugated in a way. They're angled so that the sunset was flooding into the space. And so the whole environment was just sparkling with obviously stained glass, but every material that was chosen in this specific chapel was just completely alive at that time of day. And this was in the middle of a service, and the Lutheran liturgy involves a lot of song. And so you're just moved to prayer in such a rich way that's facilitated by the architecture and also the ability to know what time of day it is at all given points. You are aware of the weather. You walk in with a very specific posture that doesn't even start the second you walk into the narthex. It actually starts when you park and you're processed into the campus by way of these walkways, and then you see the chapel at a distance. So there's a very kind of processional quality to how you enter into that space. Okay, so that's one example. Bookmark that. A couple days later, I was in Tennessee for a conference that actually my mom invited me to, and it was sort of a low church evangelical space in the middle of Knoxville, actually a little bit outside of Knoxville, so more rural. And that is a typical black box auditorium in which there's no daylight, there's no windows. The emphasis is on the preaching of the word, so an audio-visual emphasis, which has a long history as well in church architecture. But everything was sort of painted black, walls and ceilings, and etc. And there was a feeling of being like embattled and under sort of duress that you walk into that space with a very different posture. And the theme for that conference was like steadfast, like in the waves of, cultural pressures. And, it had a completely different posturing. And I just thought those two experiences back to back are helpful, at least as Christians in America, to think about really our churches have such a bearing on our posture and our attitudes, not only towards God, but really towards each other and towards specifically the culture around us. And being in a space that facilitates an awareness of the outdoors, the beauty of God's creation is so different than a dark environment where you feel under a kind of attack.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. And I think we forget so easily that we need to be oriented to spaces. Mm-hmm. We need to be psychologically warmed up to spaces. And I loved that first example that you provided in terms of just even the walkways to that front door, mm-hmm. that procession are all about really getting you into a place where you can orient yourself to God, to the transcendent, to take in that beauty in a new way, right? Mm-hmm. And that's such a beautiful example because I think we easily overlook that in our culture here. Mm-hmm. And that reminds me of, too, there's a book that I love called The Happy City by Charles Montgomery. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he wrote in that book, he says, every plaza, park, and public facade sends messages about who we are. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so fascinating because church architecture really does tell a story. It really does communicate. And I'd love to hear some more examples, if you have them, about ways that you've seen church really use architectural elements or themes to communicate about who they are or what they believe and their place in the community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think speaking in examples is so helpful because you can look it up, you can visualize, you can kind of understand these connections, which can sometimes get pretty conceptual. But some of my favorite examples that are on display at this exhibit, one that comes to mind is called the Church of the Penitent Thief. It's outside of Bologna, Italy. And the architects were quite simple about the building. It's a relatively rectangular massing, primarily white, but there's a gash that runs from floor to wall to ceiling and then back. So the entire space, the entire volume is split in two. And the only thing stitching that together is the cross of Christ at the altar. It's a very sculptural sort of linchpin. And more importantly is that they engaged a local penitentiary to equip those who are serving out their time, their sentences, on the actual construction of this church. And it equipped them with jobs and training and skill sets so that they could reemerge into the workforce with experience. And what a beautiful way of not just thinking about the form of the church, but the process by which it's built and constructed.
Yeah.
That is redemptive and doing something in the actual lives of their community.
That is absolutely beautiful. And I feel like that's like so much of the hidden messages too, right? There's so many things behind the scenes that we may not even know, but if a church is thinking intentionally, they can, wrestle through those things in ways that, we don't even see or don't even know necessarily. Very cool. I'd love to hear too, I think what's been cool to hear some of these examples too, is that some of these things don't necessarily sound super cost prohibitive. They just require thought. So when churches are thinking about designing their space, what are some things that you would suggest that they do, or questions that they ask to think about the intentionality of their design beyond just, the cost and the money right away? Are there things that you would suggest there?
I think with bringing on an architect, the architect is going to ask, and this is where sometimes a consultant can be helpful to really help facilitate these conversations so that they don't get too technical too quickly, is having the congregation, or really a committee, a building committee, or those who are committed to the process, reflect on who are you? Like, who are you as a church? What is the substance of your gathering together? Why do you meet every week or even multiple times a week? What is a defining marker of who you are as a community, as a beloved community? And even elementally, what is the thing that you do every week to proclaim yourself as that beloved community? Is that the Eucharist? Is that prayer? Is that singing together? Is that worship? And every community obviously there's so many different traditions, there's so many different denominations that have a different emphasis. And I think being able to tease out what a liturgical day in the life, or week of the life, or even year in the life of a church looks like, starts to have very spatial implications. And sometimes I think congregations, especially if you're born and raised in one tradition, that's all you know. So sometimes it can feel hard to even name what is a differentiator, because it just is. That's just church for you, and that's normal. But working across different ecumenical traditions, you realize how different they are. So, for example, being at Valparaiso, in this chapel, the font, the baptismal font, is something that you have to walk around. It is in the dead center of the main aisle, in the nave, and that is to usher you into the presence of Christ through the waters of baptism. That font does not move. So something so important about the procession around the font, you dip your hand in. And other congregations have, different sort of non-negotiables about where the altar is placed, or especially in evangelical churches that don't have these fixed liturgical elements. There's still a liturgy involved with the gathering together in a center space beforehand for coffee. There's a worshipful posture there in eating and drinking together, where we believe Christ is in our midst. He is at our table. And then we go and sit and listen and sing. And there's a different attitude, but there's a liturgy. So I think those conversations start to then open up ideas for architecture and implications. Because I think, once you kind of jump too technical too quickly, you kind of miss out on a really special and precious, I would say, time for a congregation to reflect and examine. And that starts to build consensus early.
Yeah, thinking about the importance of even the process of design and how that can speak to a church better understanding their identity and their gifting and who they are and what's important to them. Because, I think people are so quick to look at the outcome and the actual design, but thinking about the importance of that process as well. That's really fascinating. I also really liked the fact that you talked about, Protestant churches tend to have more the fellowship hour coffee in the narthex or the fellowship hall. And I will tell you, most fellowship halls I go to are just pretty terrible spaces, let's be honest. So I was thinking, if you were designing a fellowship hall or a narthex or something like that for that coffee hour, what would be the key elements that you would bring into that space to make it conducive to that time of connection and community and all of that?
I think I've seen it done in a variety of different ways. One of my favorite sort of fellowship hall areas, there's a church community not too far from where I live in New York. It's called Grace Farms, designed by some very famous Pritzker Prize winning architects called Sana, and opened not too long ago. And they have a sequence of pavilions that are all enclosed in glass. So this is a high cost example. This is if you don't have a budget. And they kind of built this like serpentine, snaking structure that descends down this hillside. And they actually pulled apart all the different programs into these little encased jewel-like glass pavilions. So there's a little tea room at one end where you can sit and have tea or coffee there's outdoor seating, and then you process up, and then there's an actual cafe and cafeteria where you can have a full meal. And then ultimately there's a chapel with a sanctuary with an incredible view of the Connecticut forest. But that would be a high price tag example where you have the land, you have the views, but really pulling apart and actually making it outward facing. So people in the community know that if they need a place to meet with a friend or connect, or if you want a simple place to read a book, that church is available and it's always open throughout the week. Versus I think some churches are very much a Sunday church, and their administrative functions are the only places that are open and available on a Monday through Saturday. But I think even in that instance, having a narthex or a community gathering space that is potentially open around the clock and being outward facing, and whether architecturally that means opening up that area with more glazing and more signage in a low cost way. And lighting can do a lot as well. A great lighting designer is a magician. So there are many examples at different price points,
right?
But it can be done.
Well, I'm curious, do you have any closing practical words of encouragement that you'd want to offer pastors and ministry leaders as they're listening today and thinking about what does this look like for our church and our community?
Yes, I am so passionate really about churches just taking the risk, taking the leap of faith to engage an architecture firm, a local architect, an international architect, and doing that process so prayerfully, because a lot of good things can come about it. It's not easy, obviously. It's not often priority. But the purpose of my exhibition, The Architecture Prayer, is really just to furnish the Christian imagination with examples of projects that have been done in the past 20 years with such an incarnational, worshipful posture that really speak to different themes of the gospel, do that well, and also expand our definition of what's possible, because I do think most American Christians, if we think of church architecture, we think of a Gothic cathedral. And we don't have examples of contemporary spaces that can animate the spirit in the same way that a Gothic cathedral once did. So I think doing some digging into these projects can, I think, yield a sense of possibility and excitement and imagination. But I think that's really my hope and prayer for this work, is that more possibilities are opened up and that church communities are willing to engage a professional, like a professional architect that isn't necessarily a church architect, but just a good architect who can listen, and magical things can happen.
Yeah. I think, again, an architect who listens well is very valuable to bring to a project like you're saying, and thinking about the fact that the way we design things does really reflect our values and who we are. And so putting money and time into that design process can be an important part of a church really displaying the gospel of Jesus to their community. So I love how you frame that. And I love, just hearing the examples that you give. It makes me really want to go check out your exhibits. I'm bummed that nothing is close to me here in St. Paul, Minnesota, but maybe at some point I'll get a chance to see your work and see some of those examples that you provided. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to have you on the Making Space podcast. And I look forward to our listeners hearing this important conversation and being inspired to hire a really good architect, maybe Amanda, I think that'd be great. So thanks for tuning in and joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Sara Joy.
All right. Thank you for joining another episode of the Making Space podcast. As always, you can learn more about this research at barna.com/making space. And if you've been encouraged or learned something new today, we'd encourage you to leave a rating or review and share this podcast with a friend. We'll catch you on the next time of Making Space podcast.